I'm here in sunny autumnal Gothenburg on the west coast of Sweden. And as Robin said, I'm a consultant that works with heritage and cultural organisations on projects that normally involve some combination of strategic challenge, technology, audience needs, and organisational capacity. And today we're going to talk about AI. It's 2025, so of course we're going to talk about AI, but more specifically, I want to look at practical uses of AI in heritage organisations. Now, hopefully, to reassure you or maybe disappoint you, this isn't going to be a hype session. This isn't about AI transforming or reinventing the sector. This is going to be about useful tools, practical approaches, pragmatic ways of thinking that I hope will help you all start to work out where AI tooling might genuinely be able to fit into and help with your day-to-day work. So, by the end of today's session, my aim is that you'll leave with some practical principles for understanding how AI works and its limitations, because I think that's really important around any tool before you start to use something that you have some sense of what it can do and how it works. A sort of simple way of thinking about where and how AI could be most useful in your work, and a bit of a framework you can use to experiment and play with AI in your organization. But first things first, when I say AI, what do I mean? Because this term has already started to encompass a pretty diverse range of technologies and applications. So, at its simplest, when I'm talking about it today, AI is about machines spotting patterns and making predictions. And you might encounter this in several forms. Generative AI includes tools like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, these platforms and tools that generate text, images, or audio. They're quite helpful when it comes to drafting, summarizing, reformatting, or creating first passes of things. Now, AI in an analysis context are models that can sift through large amounts of data to help you find themes, trends, or anomalies. So that might involve analyzing survey responses or starting to help you identify visitor sentiment. Now, recognition AI tools can, heavy quotation marks, see or hear. So they can be useful for transcribing speech, recognizing handwriting, or identifying objects in images. And lastly, automation AI are systems that can plug into your workflows. So they might help you to sort, route, or trigger actions. So that could be something as simple as automatically categorizing incoming inquiries. Now, these categories aren't mutually exclusive. Most of the most popular, most visible AI tools combine several of these capabilities. But I think starting to think about them in these terms maybe helps to clarify what they're good at. Now, you may have seen this term around agentic AI. We're starting to see some emerging work around this. So these are systems that can take a series of actions towards a goal rather than just responding to a single prompt. So they might be able to do something like review your visitor feedback, identify three areas for improvement, draft an action plan, and email it to the team. So one prompt can trigger multiple sequential actions. For now, I would say these are mostly experimental. They carry a much higher risk. You're asking AI to do much more on your behalf. So if something goes wrong partway through, say it misinterprets feedback, drafts an inappropriate response, then you can get a cascading effect. And I would say for most heritage organizations, you're unlikely to need agentic systems just yet, but it's worth knowing the term and keeping an eye on these tools as they develop. And when it comes to I like Cory Doctorow's framing. He's a tech writer and activist. And he described AI as a grab bag of useful, sometimes very useful tools that can sometimes make workers' lives better when workers get to decide how and when they're used. So for today, when I say AI, I'm really talking about operational tools you're most likely to bump into your work, into in your work. And I'm hoping that today's webinar will give you the confidence really to start to engage with that how and when they're used question. And those will be things like chatbots, maybe for visitor inquiries, drafting aids for documents or captions, transcription for meetings or oral histories, analysis for audience data or feedback, and automation for admin tasks like tagging records or email sorting. I think maybe the key is not this catch-all term of AI, but starting to think about and ask which task am I automating? And then what are the downstream effects of that for staff, volunteers, audiences? And I'll spend a bit more time on that specific question in a bit. But before that, I want to talk about hype because you will all have seen the headlines. AI will, depending on who you listen to, save us, destroy us, steal our jobs, cure cancer. And like pretty much any major new technology, AI quite neatly follows Gartner's hype cycle. So on that model, there is this initial technology trigger, a breakthrough, a new thing that creates excitement. There's then quite quickly this peak of inflated expectations, breathless promises about how it's going to transform everything. There usually then follows what they snappily call the trough of disillusionment, where tools don't live up to the hype, people start to get frustrated. Beyond that is the slope of enlightenment, which is where practical, useful use cases start to emerge. And then as technology becomes mature, it moves into this plateau of productivity where the tech becomes boring, really, but that's where it actually becomes useful. Now, I would say we're here. Most AI tooling is perhaps sliding off the peak and heading into the trough. Generative tools like ChatGPT probably hit the hype peak in 2023, 2024. But now, as people become more aware of challenges like hallucinations, increased burden of having to check AI outputs, really messy integrations, you're starting to see reality and disappointment starting to set in. Now, I would say this doesn't mean we can dismiss AI as a fad. I think what it does tell us is that we're in a sort of sorting out phase where practical, useful, repeatable applications are starting to emerge and take root. Um, and I think, it's AI is so frothy. There's so much money going into it. There's so much hype around it. As Anil Dash put it, technologies like LLMs, large language models, which underpin many of the AI tools we're aware of, have utility. But the absurd way that they've been overhyped, the fact they're being forced on everyone, and the insistence on ignoring the many valid critiques about them makes it very difficult to focus on legitimate uses where they might add value. And that's what I would hope we're trying to start to do today, to sort of look past that noise and that froth to try and understand what legitimate, grounded uses might actually look like. But I would also really encourage everyone to join or start conversations about the value of this technology, but also the ethical considerations. And I'll touch a bit more on those ethical considerations in a moment. But first, I want to talk about why AI feels hard, feels scary, feels confusing. And I think one reason might be that heritage organizations struggle with AI is that most heritage organizations don't have a very mature approach to technology adoption or experimentation. As a sector, we often don't have the bandwidth or the ability to carve out space to try things in low risk ways and to sort of test and learn. And we are, on an institutional level, typically not comfortable with uncertainty. So that means that when something big and new and vague and scary comes along, like AI, the natural response is either to sort of ignore it or to maybe wait until it is extremely established and extremely mature before engaging. And that's completely understandable because thoughtless implementations of AI, where you're just sort of throwing AI at anything, you're allowing it to do tasks whenever it suggests itself, that risks being, as Thoreau described trains, nothing more than an improved means to an unimproved end. And I think we need to really proactively engage with this technology to work out how it can be useful. We need to be specific. We need to be thoughtful about how and where we might be using it. But I want to acknowledge, some of the worry. Starting with job security. If AI can write, if it can see, if it can hear, you know, do do we still need the people working in heritage organisations? Do any of us still have a job? And I think the answer, I hope and expect, is yes, of course. But the work we're doing perhaps changes and shifts more towards judgment and interpretation and quality control rather than just data entry. So much administrative work, particularly in the sector, is data entry. And understanding and thinking about the shifts that could take place or are perhaps most likely to take place, I think is key to being able to engage with AI constructively. And there's another reason that AI can feel difficult to engage with ethically, even if it's not about day-to-day usability. AI has an enormous environmental cost. Training these models requires enormous amounts of energy. Running these tools at scale demands really significant server power. So that's electricity, but also water for cooling those service centers. And for heritage organisations who take sustainability and ethical practice really seriously, this obviously matters. Now, I don't think this means you should completely dismiss AI out of hand, but I do think it means we need to be really intentional. We need to only be thinking about AI where the benefit justifies the footprint. And I think that's about not just using it because it's there. So, as I said, I don't want to talk about transformation today. I want to sort of go back to basics and talk about what AI can realistically do, the roles it can play, and how you might test it safely. So, let's move on from why AI is hard to how it actually works. Because when we talk about AI tools, I think it's easy to imagine them as smart assistants who understand what we're saying, but the reality is quite different. And I think to be able to use them effectively in our work, it helps to be aware of some principles about how they actually work. And a useful metaphor, I think, this is the metaphor I always try and keep in mind whenever I'm using these tools, is that AI is like a really confident, enthusiastic, but quite forgetful intern. They'll produce things really quickly. They'll sound super compelling and confident, but you absolutely need to check their work. And they will not have anywhere near the subject matter expertise and the contextual understanding that everyone on this call and all of your colleagues possess. Um, so this is the first principle. At their core, tools like ChatGPT don't know facts or meanings. They are statistical prediction engines. They generate the next most probable word based on patterns in their training data. They have no model of the world. They have no real comprehension. So perhaps think of it as a parrot that has overheard thousands of conversations. It can mimic phrases that sound right, but it doesn't understand what it's saying. It uh, can't tell truth from plausible sounding fiction. So, in a heritage example, AI might describe a bronze statue correctly, but if you ask why bronze was the material that was used, it can invent a really plausible sounding story rather than pulling from your collection data or actual research, because it's predicting what sounds right, not what is right. And a really good way to see this in action is to have a conversation with a tool like ChatGPT on a subject about which you know a lot. So, for example, that might be yourself. Ask it to write a biography of you. And it will get a whole load of stuff right, but it will also almost certainly make up some really plausible sounding lies, fabrications. So the next principle, which I think is really useful to be aware of, this phrase you might have heard of when people talk about AI tools, retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. Now, that sounds pretty jargony, pretty technical, but the simple idea behind this is that models like ChatGPT don't actually read whole documents as a human would. They don't scan a 200-page report from start to finish the way you and I would. Instead, when you upload a file like that, the system breaks it into chunks. So, like dividing a report into hundreds of little index cards. And then when you ask it a question about that document, the AI sorts through those index cards, grabs the handful it thinks are most relevant, and then uses those as the basis on which to generate an answer. That's RAG. Um, and so why does this matter? It's, as I say, how most AI instead of document systems work. So customer service chatbots, policy summarization. If you've ever uploaded a PDF into ChatGPT or Claude, you've already used RAG, whether you knew the name or not. And the reason this approach exists is you would never be able to fit a whole 500-page catalog or annual report into the AI model's short-term memory, and chunking solves that. But it's quite brittle because the AI only sees a small set of those chunks of those index cards at any one time. So it can miss really important context. So, for example, if your exhibition guide has context on one page and then caveats on the next page, the AI may only grab the context, leaving the caveats out. So the answer looks confident, but it's incomplete. And that's why when you're using an AI as a summarizer or as an explainer, it really needs human review because this RAG approach is brilliant for orientation, for getting a quick sense of where you should look. But it's really dangerous if you expect the system to be able to capture nuance or edge cases. So the thing to remember is that RAG helps AI work with your documents at scale, but it's a card shuffling system. It's not a deep read. So maybe use it for orientating yourself within a report or for first drafts, but do not use it in any situation where the small print really, really matters. So the third principle, garbage in, garbage out. AI mirrors the quality of what you feed it. If your processes or your data or your documents are messy or incomplete, then the output will be. So it's like giving a chef rotten ingredients. No matter how talented the chef is, you're not going to get a tasty meal. So, for example, if your collections data has spelling mistakes or outdated attributions, the AI is going to reproduce those errors at scale. If you're trying to get it to help you with a process that is poorly defined or inconsistently followed, the AI is going to amplify that ambiguity. So, principle four, AI is not a database. If you ask the same question twice, you may get two potentially very different answers. Small wording changes in your prompt can significantly shift the result that you get. So maybe a useful metaphor is to think of it like rolling a loaded dice. The answers are weighted towards what's most common, but you can't guarantee the same result every time you roll the dice. But on the flip side, whilst the AI can seem varied and creative from a single user's perspective, at scale, it's surprisingly repetitive. So a person called Pip Bingaman at a company called Springboards ran a experiment with a whole load of different AI models. He asked the same question 100 times to these different models. The question was, pick a random number between 1 and 10. Now, ChatGPT gave the answer 7 92 times out of 100. Claude answered 7 90 times out of 100, and Gemini answered 7 all 100 times. And when Pip asked these models for a random word, the result quokka, which is a marsupial that lives on an island just off Australia, was returned 155 times. So not that random. So what does this matter for heritage work? When hundreds of people working in museums, historic buildings are asking things like, give me a creative exhibition title or give me an engaging social media caption, they are all going to be getting variations of the same answer. So from your individual vantage point, those suggestions might seem really useful and fresh, but at scale, the output is going to start to converge. And the heritage world will start to turn very samey, very beige. So AI is excellent at making one person feel like they're getting a personalized creative output, but it struggles with truly divergent thinking. It prefers structure and coherence over emotional depth or any genuine exploration. So if you're using it for creative work around exhibition titles, interpretation text, audience engagement, I would really encourage you to always push beyond the first few suggestions and always add a human input, add a human lens onto any of those results you're getting. So the next principle is about tokens and context limits, essentially the AI's working memory. Because all of these systems have this concept of a working memory, and it's surprisingly short. It can only hold a certain number of words or tokens in its mind at any one time before the earlier ones start to slip away. So it's goldfish-like with its attention span. It can only keep the first few tokens or the first few chunks in focus at any given time. So 200-page policy manual won't all fit in its head, and it will only recall whatever small sections were retrieved for the query. And that's why you can sometimes get into these really frustrating loops where you end up going, I already told you this, I told you this earlier. But from the AI's perspective, that earlier detail has already scrolled out of its memory. It literally can't remember it unless you reintroduce the idea or the guidance. So when you're working with long or complex material or a long series of prompts, don't assume that AI is retaining an entire record of that conversation. Be ready to repeat guidance or reattach context. Maybe treat it as if you're talking to a slightly distracted or forgetful colleague. You're really going to have to issue reminders. The next principle is AI is a blending machine. It's often going to be blending your data or your inputs with its general training knowledge, which is drawn from the internet at large. And it often adds in filler to make answers sound smoother or more convincing. So for example, you might feed it catalog notes, but it could then mix in general knowledge about an artist that's disputed or just outright inaccurate. The next principle, I sort of touched on this earlier, but when you're using AI or automation, you're not erasing that work. You're just shifting where the work happens. So AI doesn't make the work disappear. I think it changes who does what, and it often pushes the effort downstream. So instead of creating something from scratch, you maybe spend your time checking, correcting, and reworking what the system has produced. It's like buying one of those robot vacuum cleaners. Yes, it vacuums, but you still have to tell it where and when to clean. You have to empty the bin, you have to pick up cables, and with most of these cleaners, you still have to get into the corners. The work shifts, but it doesn't vanish. So, for example, AI might draft 50 catalog entries in a flash, but then curators have to spend longer checking and correcting those outputs than if they'd written 10 of them carefully themselves. The appearance of productivity and the convincing nature of outputs often hides a lot of invisible cleanup work. So this is what people are starting to call AI slop in workplaces, a lovely evocative term. And those are things like drafts that look really polished but are full of small errors or vague generalities. Reports that are padded out with really repetitive or formulaic language, content that actually needs so much editing that it doesn't save you any time, and documents that look technically done but are actually not that useful or are full of inaccuracies. Now, I think this problem is really problematic because it's subtle, but I think it could have a really serious impact, especially in resource constrained organizations, which is most heritage organizations, because teams can get buried in spending more time fixing the outputs from these AI tools than producing their own. Organizations risk mistaking volume for quality, whereas actually you're just getting a lot of output with little substance. And also, skills can really start to atrophy if staff are spending most of their time cleaning up this slop rather than using their own skills and practicing their own craft. And the worry is that the workplace starts to fill up with this sort of half-baked material, presentations, policies, copy that look fine at a glance, but start to degrade clarity and degrade trust. So the real question isn't, can the AI do this, but does this shift genuinely make the world better? Because if AI is just creating more slop to tidy, the net effect is negative, wasted time, demoralized staff, erosion of quality. So I think the lesson is automation is valuable when you're being thoughtful about it, not just when you're thinking it's going to sort of magically solve a problem. Now, next, AI tools are not replacements, they're assistants when they're most effective. You still need humans for judgment, for ethics, for accountability. So maybe think of it like an autopilot. It can perhaps fly the plane steadily, but a human absolutely needs to be there to take control for takeoff, for landing, for turbulence. So, for example, an AI chatbot can maybe handle simple questions about opening hours or pricing or parking, but staff probably need to be ready to step in for complaints about accessibility or sensitive repatriation issues. Now, the last principle goes back to that question of ethics again. AI models learn from vast amounts of training data, which is mostly drawn from the wider internet, which means they absorb the biases, the gaps, and the assumptions baked into that content. And most of the training data used to train these models skews heavily Western English language dominant cultural narratives. And some recent research carried out by academics at Harvard identified that the further someone's cultural distance from the USA, the less correlated ChatGPT responses are to their cultural values. So it's sort of like learning history from just one textbook. You miss the wider, more enriched, more complete perspective. So in an AI context, um, it might misidentify or mislabel non-Western artifacts. It might use outdated or offensive terminology. It might default to Eurocentric interpretations. So if you're working with diverse collections or contested histories or culturally sensitive material, you need to really actively check for those blind spots. So, AI tools are powerful, but they're not magical. Um, so I want to talk a bit about the roles that AI can play now. One of the most useful pieces of work I've come across on this comes from a person called Helen Edwards at the Artificiality Institute, which is an excellent name for an institute. And her research shows that people don't just use AIs in a single way, they assign it roles. And those roles can either strengthen or weaken our own capabilities. Now, she identified three psychological considerations that help shape this. So, the first is called cognitive permeability, and that is how far the AI extends into your own reasoning. The second concept was called identity coupling, and that's about how much of your confidence or identity gets tied up with the AI's performance. And the third concept was called symbolic plasticity, and that's how well you can shift meaning from AI into new contexts. Now, put together, Helen's work identified a spectrum of 8 roles that people give AI when they're using these tools. So the doer is AI as a sort of grunt work helper. The outsourcer is where AI does the whole thing. You're stepping aside, you're just giving agency to the AI to do whatever it is you want it to do. Framer is when you're using the AI as a lens to help you shape your own understanding. Creator is where you're using the AI to spark ideas that you then develop. Catalyst is when you're using the AI to expose gaps in your own thinking. The builder is where you're using an AI to stress test your existing work. The partner is when you're using the AI as a collaborator alongside you. And a co-author is where the AI feels really fused into your work and identity. And I think the trap is in the outsourcer role. And Helen's work was looking at students using AI in their learning at university. And she noticed that when students let AI do their assignments, they got the appearance of competence without any of the underlying skills. They felt like they were learning, but actually their reasoning muscles were atrophying. It was a real false confidence. Now, I've tried to take these 8 roles and apply them in a heritage context. So the doer is maybe sorting visitor inquiries into categories. The summarizer is maybe boiling down a 50-page policy into a single-page briefing for colleagues. The analyst is maybe spotting trends in visitor surveys or ticketing data. The sparring partner, which I think is similar to Catalyst, is maybe throwing out ideas for an exhibition title or challenging your assumptions. The adapter or translator, which is sort of like the framer creator role, is maybe adapting curatorial text into something that's more child friendly. The ghostwriter, which is like the co-author, is maybe drafting blog posts or entries that you then refine. And the automaton, the outsourcer, is handing the whole thing over, which I think in a heritage context is rarely a good idea. So I think the question we need to start asking ourselves is what role am I asking the AI to perform in this task? Because the same tool can strengthen or weaken our work depending on the role we assign it. As a doer, it maybe frees up our time. As a partner, it maybe expands what's possible. But as an outsourcer, it can de-skill teams, it can introduce errors, it can erode trust. And again, relating back to that education context, the warning that Helen's research flagged is that overusing AI as an outsourcer produces people who look capable but lack the ability to do independent reasoning. And I think in heritage, the danger is similar. Collections, interpretation, audiences rely on context, they rely on our judgment, they rely on sensitivity. And if we let AI become the outsourcer, we risk flattening all of that nuance and losing what makes our work distinctively human. So maybe if we want to sort of categorize these by risk level, the sort of low risk end, I think you've got roles where AI is handling volume and repetition. It's sorting, it's summarizing, it's analyzing. These are usually safe starting points because the stakes are relatively low and the outputs are easy to double check and correct. In the middle, you've maybe got the roles like the sparring partner or the adapter. They're great for experimentation, for maybe sparking ideas or reshaping materials for different audiences. The risk is higher because if the AI misses nuance or starts to sort of flatten your tone of voice, you might need to spend more time correcting it. And then at the sort of high end of the risk is the ghostwriter and the outsourcer. Here you're letting the AI take on much more of the creative or interpretive load. It can feel really efficient, but it's where errors, loss of nuance, and trust issues start to creep in. So when you're deciding how to use AI, I think it's not just about what's possible, it's being deliberate about risk. I think ask yourself, which hat am I giving it? And is that the right role for the stakes of this task? So, AI is not one thing. I think we need to be really deliberate about what role we're asking it to play and what that means for the skills, judgment, and relationships that only humans can deliver on. So, how do we know what kinds of tasks AI is actually good at? One simple way is to think about it as a two by two grid. On one axis, we have stakes. What happens if the task goes wrong? Low consequences at one end, high consequences at the other. And on the other axis, we have repetition. Is this something you do every day, all the time, or is it something unique and one off? So if we plot these together, I think we can see four pretty clear zones. Low stakes and repetitive is probably the sweet spot, the best place to start. I think this is where AI probably most quickly delivers value. Things like tagging images, sorting visitor inquiries, drafting routine summaries. This work is much more predictable, the risk is lower, and the time savings can add up really quickly. High stakes and repetitive is maybe dangerous without oversight, things like conservation protocols, safety instructions, compliance reporting. A single big error here has really big consequences. Automating at this level requires some really exceptional safeguards and humans absolutely being involved in reviewing that work. In the bottom left, we've got low stakes and unique or creative. I would say this is where it's safe to experiment. So that might be brainstorming an exhibition title, generating ideas for content, exploring new formats. If the AI comes up with total nonsense, you've not lost anything. And sometimes it's going to spark ideas that you won't have had otherwise. And lastly, in the bottom right, we've got high stakes and unique. Now, I would say for the time being, that is a human only zone. That's the space of judgment, expertise, sensitivity, things like provenance research, handling a sensitive visitor complaint, interpreting cultural heritage. These tasks require huge experience, context, nuance, responsibility. I would say steer clear of applying AI in that context because I don't think AI is for everything. I think the most effective applications are where you can be clear-eyed, use it where volume is high, stakes are low, experiment where it's safe, but absolutely keep the humans in control where the consequences nearly really matter. And again, just to come back to that question, try asking, what exactly am I automating and what happens as a result? Because I think AI starts to become dangerous when we treat it as if it's doing everything. I think the real gains come from small, discrete automations. And maybe there are three questions that could help with that. So, first, what exactly is being automated? And I would encourage you to be really, really specific here. It's very different to say AI will classify visitor inquiries into categories than it is to say AI is going to manage our customer service. The first of those is small and safe and definable and controllable. The second is vague and super risky. The second question is what shifts downstream? Every automation, every application of AI is going to have knock-on effects. So if AI starts to classify your visitor inquiries, staff might save time at the start of that process, but they may now spend more time on complex or sensitive inquiries, which require maybe different skills, more care. Your processes may need to adapt. And the third question is what are we actually gaining and what is the risk? Because you might gain efficiency and consistency and freed up staff time, but you might start to lose context or you might start to reduce the ability for staff to make informed judgments or remove the human touch that visitors actually value. And just to say again, don't use AI for high stakes, high context, or high nuance tasks. So that's things like anything involving legal compliance, probably anything involving conservation, ethics, cultural sensitivity. AI is a tool, but not for everything. And before you try any of these tools, this is just a plea to check your house rules. If your organization has an AI policy, read it, understand it, use it. If it doesn't have a policy, don't wait, ask for one, or maybe just propose a lightweight set of principles so people know what's sort of in and out of scope when you're using these AI tools. Because clarity reduces risk. Teams will know where AI is okay when it comes to maybe drafts or summaries, and when it's not okay, maybe when it comes to anything involving legal implications, safeguarding, conservation decisions. Consistency builds trust. So visitors, funders, colleagues will start to be able to see that you're using AI thoughtfully and hopefully responsibly. And clear rules make it easier to run pilots without the need for endless approval. So they speed things up. A simple policy might cover purpose. So, what do you use AI for? Red lines, where AI is absolutely not used. Data handling, so what we can and can't upload. How human oversight is going to happen. And then the pilot process. So that might be, we have a small scope, how we're measuring success, what the plan for rollback is, and who's signing that off. And if nothing exists, I would really suggest you propose just some initial AI use principles. It doesn't need to be perfect, but it needs to be clear. If you start there and then improve it after each pilot or after each use, then you're going to be able to experiment with AI much more safely. As Sarah Winters from Content Design London put it, if you give your teams the time and permission to get it right, and you let them put in the thinking time, you're going to save a lot of time, money, and possibly legal fees later on. Because good policy isn't about slowing things down for the sake of it, it's about creating the conditions for safer, smarter work. And here's what some simple but hopefully useful AI principles might look like. This will give people a really clear steer on how to engage with AI experiments and usage. And I can share this deck with you afterwards. So I'm going to start rattling through things because I do want to leave time for questions, but I want to share a simple framework. Because earlier I talked about why AI adoption has often been slow or ineffective in our sector because we don't really have a super strong culture of test and learn or experimentation. We're not always comfortable with uncertainty. So the way forward isn't transformation overnight. I think the best approach for heritage organizations is a program of safe, structured, intentional experiments. And here's a sort of seven-step process that you can hopefully use after this to test AI in your organization. So the first is just describing the work clearly. Um, Break the process into steps, almost like you're writing an instruction manual. So take that visitor inquiries example. Step one, an email comes in. Step two, we categorize it. Step three, we route it to the right person. Step four, someone crafts a response. Step five, we send it back to the visitor. And if you can't write down a process in that way, then it's definitely not ready for AI to be introduced into it. Next, identify the role that AI could play, because the temptation is to ask, could AI handle the whole thing? But I think the better question to ask is which single step could it initially support? So in that inquiry example, maybe it can help with step two, categorizing whether something is about tickets, venue hire, or accessibility. But step four, writing a response to a complaint, that is absolutely for humans. So scope it really tightly, give it a role to wear, to perform. So doer, summarizer, analyst, not the entire job. Step three is sort of once you know the step you're going to be focusing the AI on, you can do some research and pick the right tool for it. If it's transcription, that might mean you use something like Otter. If it's creating step-by-step guides, you might use something like Scribe. If it's summarization, Claude or ChatGPT can do that. So I think this flips the mistake that I see so often of organizations starting with a shiny new tool and looking for a use case. Instead, I'd encourage you to start first with the use case and the task, and then find the tool that fits. Step four is about ripple effects. Now, as I said, automation doesn't erase work, it shifts it. So if AI starts sorting inquiries, maybe your staff won't see the whole inbox anymore. That maybe saves time, but they also lose context. So that maybe means you need to introduce new ways for your customer service staff to understand that context. Maybe that's a daily digest or a review queue. So always ask, if AI does this step, what do we need to change? What do people gain? What do people lose? And what might we need to introduce or change to mitigate that impact? Step five, don't skip this one. How will you know if it's working? You need to define success. Are you trying to save your staff time? Are you trying to improve consistency and reduce errors? Pick a really specific set of measures before you start and run it as a pilot, because otherwise you're not going to know if the effort and the change is actually worth it. Step six is to put in safeguards. Where do humans need to stay involved? So, for example, if you're using AI to draft meeting notes, you maybe make a decision that it's never going to send an official communication without a human checking it first. And I would say decide your red lines up front so you can test safely without risking trust. This last step is about knowing, most AI tools, ChatGPT, Claude, Microsoft Copilot, will send any data you put into it to an external server for processing, which is maybe fine when you're thinking about FAQs or internal memos, but it could be a real problem if you're working with unpublished research, donor information or sensitive visitor data, culturally sensitive material or information about repatriation cases, or anything commercially confidential. Always check the tool's terms of service. Some providers, like OpenAI and Anthropic, offer paid tiers where they won't use your data for training, but almost all of the free versions will use your data for training. And if in doubt, do not upload it. If you wouldn't put it in a public Google Doc, don't put it in a public AI tool.